sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe. Oh, but ain't
Welcome to the Avram Davidson universe, where we listen to some of the greatest stories ever written, adored by Ursula Le Guin, Neil Gaiman, Leonard Nimoy, Ray Bradbury, and Stephen King. Enjoy classic tales such as Are All the Seas with Oysters, The Golem, Sources of the Nile, and many others. Hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the Avram Davidson universe. Very excited for today's guest, Tim Anderson, who is a former journalist and PR manager. He started writing fiction seriously 3 years ago and now has placed more than 50 pieces in a wide variety of genres and publication. He began reading science fiction and fantasy from an early age. He has a blog and he's been an incredible supporter of Avram. So we are looking forward to having him on momentarily. We're going to be listening to Bumberboom from F&SF, originally published in December of 1996. We're also going to be listening at the very end. I will be putting a symphony piece that was adapted based on Bumberboom, which should be a lot of fun. With that said, we're always looking for more guests. If you're interested, let me know. You can contact me at avramdavidson.com, and Tim should be on momentarily. Tim, thanks so much for joining.
It's my very great pleasure. I love talking about the authors I love, and Avram's definitely one of those.
Well, before we get into Avram, tell us what you're up to these days.
I retired a while ago, sort of, because I then immediately after retiring from local government took over a pub with my wife, and then after 3 years we came out of that. We've done various things and then, including lots of work as supporting artists in films and television programs, and tomorrow I'm off to do some recording with Jules in a feature film that a friend of ours is doing, and then when COVID hit, and I've been doing some writing, but when that hit, I started to do it a lot, and including doing a sort of Oulipo exercise where I would ask people via social media for a character name, a location, and a genre, and then write a story around that. And basically I've been writing ever since. Since then I've managed to place more than 50 short stories and articles in a variety of genre and different publications, and that's what I'm continuing to do because I love it.
That's great. Well, you've been an incredible supporter of what I've been doing and giving some great comments and blogs, and so I'm very thankful. Tell me how you first discovered Avram.
Back in the 1960s, when I was in my teens, Woolworths used to have a bin of books which they'd had been imported as remaindered books from the United States, which they sold very cheap, so I could afford them, and read quite a few Ace Avram titles then. And then when I went to university, I was in Manchester. I used to travel down to London quite regularly, and discovered that there were actually bookshops that sold US titles, and bought the Ace science fiction specials of Phoenix and the Mirror and The Island Under the Earth. And ever since then, any Avram title I see, I will get. And I then started to the joys of Amazon and online book sales means that you can actually get virtually any title you want, in print or not. So I was able to catch up and read lots of his works, which were out of print at the time.
Yeah, so some of the ones I've noticed that are available, unfortunately, like I'll give an example. The Esterhazy, The Adventures of Esterhazy, I'm seeing for $300 right now. So fortunately, we're getting some of these back into print, which I'm really excited about. They're maybe not as beautiful as that hard copy edition, but at least they'll be available to readers. So
The only disappointing thing about the Esterhazy hard copy was that it didn't have the map in, because I bought the paperback edition as well, which has the map in.
oh my gosh, I wonder. So that was done by John Westfall, which was a dear family friend of ours. And I don't have it in front of me, but funny enough, we're reprinting it. It's not going to have the art that the original had, but the cover is actually going to be the map.
Brilliant.
So that's how we're gonna incorporate it.
Yeah, because I love fantasy maps.
Yep.
I'd scanned it and blew it up, and it's hidden inside my copy of Post's
Oh, that's
book of maps of fantasy places.
so going into Avram. So you're how old are you when you're going through the Walrus bins, would you say? If you just thinking about then.
Maybe 14, 15, 16, that sort
So
of
what
age.
so tell me your first Avram book, you're picking it up. How did that strike you? It's got to be a little bit different than everything else, that you were reading. So to tell me a little bit about that.
It was wonderful. It was particularly the short stories, which I
Yep.
loved. I wasn't as much of a fan of the early science fiction novels,
Yep.
because since discovered that they're still Avram, but they're not Avram in his prime and writing what he wanted to write. But the
Yep.
short stories were amazing, and I've loved short stories. It was one of the two best books I found there. The other one being Lafferty's 900 Grandmothers.
Mm-hmm. And if you had to pick your favorite Avram short stories or novels, but I know in general his short stories were crafted the way that he wanted to craft them. What are your favorites?
I think my favorites are the Esterhazy short
Mm-hmm.
stories and the Lime Killer ones,
Mm.
because he's writing about, in the Esterhazy ones, he's writing about the Europe he knows from his obviously voluminous and wide-spanning reading,
Mm-hmm.
and created that. And in the Lime Killer one, it's obviously writing about a country that he knows well. And the fact that the both of them are full of, because the Esterhazy one is obviously picking up on the emigre communities that he knew growing up in New York, and
Yep.
their stories and their backgrounds. And in both of them, as in I think in Bumberboom, he's showing his breadth of knowledge and depth of knowledge of folklore, and using that to enrich the stories.
In agreed 100%, and really exciting. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but we have Dragons in the Trees. I don't know if you've seen me talk about that. It's ready to go.
Excellent.
I'm just trying to decide on a publication date, and you may know this, but for those that don't, it's basically Auburn's travel journal from Bay Area down to Belize, and then his time in Belize. It is so much fun. It's such a fun read, and it's great. And I'm so excited to get that out. I'm just trying to get a sense of the best date to publish it, maybe for his 101st birthday. I'm not
Yeah.
totally sure, but any advice? I'm always. Some people are asking me when I'm going to publish it, and I'm always asking, when's the best time to publish a book? This is still new to us, so I'm always open to advice.
Well, for me, preferably for November the 23rd, because that's my birthday, and that means I can put it on my to buy wish list for presents.
November 20th. All right, we'll get it before then.
Excellent.
All right. So talking about Bumberboom, which is a story we're going to be listening to today. And I know some of your favorite stories have been selected already, although interestingly, we have not had a podcast yet on Esterhazy, which I can't wait to do. But what made you choose Bumberboom?
It's mature Avram. It's a
Yep.
slightly unusual story for Avram because it's definitely in the picaresque genre.
Yep.
And he didn't write much straight high fantasy in the sense of those created secondary worlds. Although it's fairly clear from the story that actually it's our world that the story's set in the future. And it's also a bit of a comedy of manners, which is a genre I like as well.
Yep.
So that appealed to me tremendously. And it was also a story that I had before you brought out AD 100 that I'd got, and then I'd searched because I bought it I think it was in the Flashing Swords, one of the Flashing Swords anthologies. Although I think it was fantasy and science fiction originally. And I then searched for ages to find the Terry Carr New Worlds of Fantasy edition, which had the sequel Basilisk in it.
So one thing, I don't know if you're aware of this, you may know this, but there were some people, there was some talk of Avram writing a Bumberboom novel or novel around the main character. And there were these two Bumberboom and Basilisk short stories. What not many people know is that he had actually written the novel,
Right.
an entire novel, and it was stolen out of his car in Mexico. The actual the draft or the manuscript. So the completed manuscript was stolen out of his car in Mexico. And so at that time, I think he just couldn't go back and rewrite it. So he brought these short stories, but this was actually an entire novel, which it's really unfortunate that was stolen.
Yeah, and I'm guessing they probably bookended what the novel was, in the sense that Bumberboom was obviously the start of that.
Yep.
Perhaps a bit back in his home kingdom, when you find out a bit more about what's happened there, and then Basilisk right at the end of it.
Right. Yeah. So it's obviously it's a shame. That would have been an incredible read, and I wonder. I think he wanted to do more, but I think once it got stolen, it was typical Avram, which is understandable. You'd spend all that time writing that. It's like I got to move on to something else. Well, with that, you wanna go ahead and take a listen?
Absolutely, yeah.
Let's do it.
Bumberboom, written by Avram Davidson, narrated by David Pickering. Along the narrow road, marked a few times with cairns of whitewashed stones, a young man came by with a careful look and a deliberate gait, and a something in his budget which went drip-a-drip red. The land showed gardens and fenced fields and flowering fruit trees. The bleating of sheep sounded faintly. The young man's somewhat large mouth became somewhat smaller as he reflected how well such a land might yield, and as he wondered who might hold the yield of it. Around the road's bend he came upon a small house of wood, with an old man peering from the door with weepy eyes that gave a sudden start on seeing who it was whose feet sounds on the road had brought him from his fusty bed, and his scrannel legs shook. "Fortune favour you, senior," the young man said, showing his empty palms. "I do but seek a chance place to build a fire to broil the pair of leverets which Fortune has sent my way for breakfast." The old man shook his head and stubble beard.
Leverets, my young, should not be seared on a naked fire. Leverets should be stewed gently in a proper pot with carrots, onions, and a leaf of laurel, to say the least."
With a sigh and a smile and a shrug, the young man said, "You speak as much to the wit as would my own father, who, I will conceal nothing, is high man to the hereditor of land Canaris, a land not totally without fortune's favour, though not the puissant realm it was before the great gene shift. Woe! And my own name, it is Malian, son Hazel-lip." The old man nodded and bobbled his throat.
"This place, to which I make you free, though poor in all but such mere things as pot and fire and garden herbs, this place, I say, is mine. Ronan it is called, and I am by salutary custom called only Ronans. To be sure, I have another name, but in view of my age and ill health you will excuse my not pronouncing it, lest some ill-disposed person overhear and use the knowledge to work a malevolence upon me. Yonder is the well at which you may fill the pot. So, and who can be ignorant of the past and present fame of land Canaris, that diligent and canny country, in which doubtless flourishes a mastery of medicine of geography, medicine of art and craft, and medicine of magic, as well as other forms of healing? Who? Enough. Water, my young. The leverets are already dead and need not be drowned."
The stew of young hares was sweet and savoury, and Ronan's put his crusts to soak in the juice, remarking that they would do him well for his noon meal.
"Oh, ha,
he said, with a pleasurable eructation.
how much better a hare's in the pot with carrots than in the garden with them. And what brings you here, my young?"
He sought for a fragment of flesh caught by a rotting tush.
"To the small enclave which is this section, not properly termable a land, and under the beneficent protection of themselves, the kings of the dwarfs, what, eh?"
He rolled his rufous and watery eyes swiftly to his guest, then ostentatiously away. Malian gave a start, and his hand twitched towards his sling and pouch, none of which totally escaped roomy old Ronan's, for all his silly miming. "I should have known," Malian growled, bringing his thick brown brows together in a scowl. "Those cairns of whited stones, it is a bandy sign, isn't it?" Now how the old senior rolled his watery eyes up and down and shook his head.
"We make no use of that pejorative expression, my young. We do not call them bandies, no, we call them the kings of the dwarfs, so."
He winked, pouching up one cheek, squeezing out a tear.
"And we are grateful for their benevolences, yes, we are."
He drew down the corners of his cavernous and hound-lipped mouth in a mocking expression.
"Let the dwarfs humorously call us stick-pins, but bandy? No, sir, that word is not to be used."
And he rambled on and on about the dwarfy men and his loyalty, meanwhile drawing his face into all sorts of mimes and mows which mocked of his words, when there came in from the distance a confused noise, at which he fell silent and hearkened, his mouth drooping open and nasty. It was not until they were outside in the clear day that they could hear the noise resolve into a shouting or a howling and a continuous rumbling and rattling. Old Ronan's began to shake and mumble, keeping very close to his visitor, as though having observed again that this one had large hands and shoulders, and was young and seemingly strong.
"Fortune forfend that there should be foreign troops in the section,"
he quavered.
"And outrage not to be born. Do I not pay my tax and levy for all that I'm a stick-pin? Go up a bit, my young, on that hill where I point, and see what is the cause and source of all this unseemly riot, not exposing yourself unduly, but taking pains to spy out everything."
So up Malian went, spiralling along the hill through the fragrant acacias and the stinking reptilian sumacs, and so to the top, where, through the coppice peering, he could see all these good fenced fat lands and the deep wide grasslands. But more immediately below and along the road he saw a most unprecedented sight, stood open-mouthed and tugged the coarse bottoms of his bifurcated beard, grunting in astonishment. He turned and through cupped hands called once, "Come up!" and turned again to watch further, paying no whit to the querulous pipings and pantings of the ancient. Up from around the concealing curve of another hill, and along what Malian conceived must be the famed broad road which led to and through the whole length of the erst marshes, came a procession in some ways reminiscent of pilgrim throngs, or decimated tribes fleeing famine or pestilence or plunder. Men and women and children clad in rags, when clad at all, some few free afoot, some fewer riding, but most of them attached in one way or other to the thing ridden. A thing immense, of great length, tubular, rather like the most gigantic blowgun the most inflamed imagination might conceive of, trundling and rumbling along on enormous and metal-shod wheels, the spokes and rims as thick as a man, some of them in harness, to which they bent so low that they were horizontal, squatting as though for greater traction, some bowing as though at huge oars, pushing against beams thrust through the spokes, some straining their arms against the rims of the wheels, or against the body or butt of the monstrous engine, others pushing with their backs. This tremendous contrivance rocked and rumbled and shook and rolled on, and all the while its attendants roared and shouted and howled, and the wind shifted and flung the stink of them into Malian's face. "In fortune's name, what is it?" he demanded of old Ronans, extending an arm to pull him up. The senior looked and shrieked and moaned, and pressed his cheeks with his palms. "What is it?" cried Malian, shaking him. Ronans threw out his arms. "Juggernaut!" he screamed. "Juggernaut! Bumberboom!" All that frightened old Ronans had to do, indeed was able to do, was skitter back to his little house and release the pigeon whose arrival in the proper belled cage of its home dovecot would not only inform the local Confederate dwarf king that something was wrong in his realm, but would inform him a fairly close approximation of where. Yet the old man refused utterly to perform this small task by himself, would not unhand Malian at all, and pulled him along with him until they were back at the senior's place and the bird released. Remain with me, my young," he pleaded, loose tears coursing down his twitching face. "At least until the sectional constabulary shall have arrived and set things aright." But the last thing which Malian wanted was an interview with a bandy border guardsman. He arose and shook his head. Stay, do. I have smoked pullets, and both black beer and white strained comb honey, dried fruits. He began to enumerate the attractions of abiding, but was interrupted in a way he had not fancied to be. A smile full of teeth parted Malian's light brown beard. Good. Not bad for one of your priorly announced poverty. Well may one envy the rich of this section. Now, as a reward for my accompanying you back here, to say nothing of the work of topping that mountainous hill to obtain intelligence for you, let you replenish, and quickly, my budget here with as many such smokelings as will fit. Then you may fill the chinks and interstices with the aforesaid dried fruits. No, another word not. I am too modest to appreciate the compliments you would pay me by a continued solicitation of my presence. 1 jug of black beer I may be persuaded to take. The honey I must forego until another occasion. So, Fortune favour you, senior Ronans. One further deed we may do each other. You will not need to inform your dwarfy men of my presence or passage. I, in turn, will not need to inform them, unless I am stopped by them, of course, of your treasonous grimaces and repetitions of the fell name of Bandy. Sun shine upon you, and forfend the shadow of the juggernaut Bumberboom." Thus, laughing loudly, he left the ancient as he had first found him, weeping and alarmed, and went on his way. Indeed, he had fully retraced his way to the top of the hill before he realized that he had not asked the question. He scowled and fingered his long moustaches, deliberating a return, but finally decided against it. Such an old, query man would know no medicine of any sort, he assured himself, let alone wit of this most vital matter. But I will keep in mind his words about the vaporous device which pumps and drains the erst marshes, for, if indeed it is not a mere vapour of the senior himself, and how he cozened me out of half a hair, shame! For such medicine may well imply the presence of more. We will see. The road was riddled and griddled with great ruts from the gigantic gun-wheels. Amidst clots of filth lay a man who had unjudiciously interposed his neck between wheel and road, and a child who mewed and yippered at Malian, but made no attempt to walk. Man and child, quick and dead, looked as like as the spit of their mouths, blonde hair so pale as to be almost as white as that of the people of the moon, equally pale, but pale, pale blue of small, small eyes, a sort of squinting blankness of expression, and slack, silly mouths. Idiot father and idiot son was Malian's impression, and he wondered how they had come to be with the gun crew, and he went on. Warm was the day, and the beer soon went down swift. Malian was about to hoist the jug for the last time when he heard a too well-remembered thudding on the road, and looked quickly from one to another side for cover. But the land was flat for many arms' lengths on either side of the road. "Curse!" he muttered, and reached with a sigh for sling and stones, when he bethought that he might hide, did he trot fast, behind a certain maple tree. Malian trotted, saw the ditch behind the tree, tumbled into it, cod over cap, and had just time to right himself and peer out as the thud-thud, thud-thud of hooves came by, and he saw the mounts. There were two of them, fat and hairy, barrel-bodied bandy ponies, a description which would as well have fit the two squat dwarfy men riders, whose short legs fit the curves of their mounts' sides as though steamed and bent thereto. Large heads, broad backs, beards which would reach to their protruding navels if not whipped away by wind, faces neither grim nor alarmed, but intent and determined, the bandies came at the gallop. The scabbards of their slashers were on their backs, within quick reach of their hands. They looked to neither side, nor did they speak. In a moment more they were gone. But the crossroads, when he came to them, swarmed with people.
"They have taken everything eatable in my house,"
a woman wailed, gesturing to the empty shelves revealed by the open doors. But another cried,
"Take? I didn't wait for them to take. I gave them all there was to eat in mine." "Wisely done, wisely done," a man agreed, wiping from his red face a sweat which came from agitation rather than heat. "Food can always be purchased. Food is even now growing and grazing. Food, in short, can be replaced. But how can one replace that destroyed by the destruction sure to be caused if the crew of Bumberboom were to fire even one shot from their enormous cannon? Surely it would shatter bodies and houses alike."
And a fourth person, by his look and manner probably someone of some stature in the community, said in a sober tone of voice, as he patted the middle front of his well-filled tunic,
All this is very true, but since the community and property of the section as a whole is threatened, it is not a problem to be entirely dealt with by individuals. Fortunately, as we have seen, our protectors have been alerted. 2 of their constables have already passed by, and by now are doubtless making arrangements with the cannon's crew. It is equally fortunate, he pointed out, looking around and gathering in the approval of the crowd, that the demands of the crew of Bumberboom are so modest, that it is only food they seek, and not women, or power, or dominion. For who could resist in the face of that tremendous and destructive engine?
Someone else muttered that it might be better for the crew if their needs were not limited to food alone, but included water, soap, and a change of clothing. There were scattered laughs at this. The magnate, however, pursed his lips and drew his face into lines of disapproval.
"That is as it may be," he said severely. "The educated person knows that customs differ among different people, and it is not for us to risk offending the crew of Bumberboom by making gauche comments on such matters. For my part, so long as they withdraw satisfied from the section, I care not if they ever or never bathe again."
Clearly he spoke for the majority, and the majority slowly began to disperse to go about their other business, confident that the dwarf agents would deal with the matter which had so excited and upset them. Malian approached the magnate and saluted him, the latter returning the gesture with an air of mildly surprised condescension.
"Whence and whither, strange my young?" he inquired, "and for why?"
Mal sighed.
"Ah, senior, your question not only sums up the matter, it places a finger upon the sore centre of it. The whence is easily answered. Land Canaris, a land afflicted and perplexed. As to whither, I do not yet know, and can say only that I am wandering in search of a medicine which will supply an answer, which last, I perceive you have already realized, comprises the why. But before I speak of that, I would inquire of you concerning a current matter. Sympathize with my ignorance, and inform me as to what is Bumberboom, or Juggernaut, as I have heard it also denominated, and who its crew may be."
The magnate's face had shown a conflict between flattery at Mal's compliments and unease at the prospect of being involved in his problems. But the gathering round of a few gaping loungers, eager for free diversion, decided his mind.
"Important matters,"
he said importantly, holding up his chin so that his jowls withdraw,
"are not to be discussed where every lackworth may gawp and crane at an inoffensive visitor. Come along with me, my young, and I will not scruple to take time away from my many important affairs and inform you."
And as they walked slowly through the crossroads hamlet, he related to him that Bumberboom was an engine or contrivance of both great size and potency, founded upon the principles of a medicine known only to its crew. It had the capacity of casting great shots over great distances, accompanied, so it was said, by hideous and deadly fires and deadly and hideous noises. Whence it had been derived, when and by whom made, only the crew itself could say, and they, perhaps naturally enough, would not.
Suffice it that they have the secret of this medicine, and that they use it to go whither they will, depending for sustenance upon the inevitable desire of those among whom they wander, that they immediately wander elsewhere, without giving an exhibition of their powers, which would prove painful in the extreme. Thus, my young, is your question answered. As for your problems, I greatly regret that my civic and commercial duties do not permit me to indulge in hearing them. I must content myself reluctantly with saying that no land under the beneficent protection of the kings of the dwarfs can be either afflicted or perplexed, and on this note I, alas, must take my leave. Fortune favour you.
He waddled off briskly towards a showy dwelling-place from which came kitchen smells indicative that at least one household had left the supply of food to the crew of Bumberboom for the governing powers to deal with. "The sun shine upon you," Mal said, somewhat glumly, for he had learned very little from the man which he had not already been able to deduce by himself. But as he reflected on the possible uses of Bumberboom, it occurred to him that therein it was conceivable lay an answer to his quest and question, though not in any way which he had previously considered. The hamlet fell away behind him, and as he continued along the famed broad road, he saw upon its dusty surface the hoof-prints of the dwarfish ponies, and the grooves made by the great wheels of Bumberboom. Slowly he began to smile, and then he quickened his steps and strode briskly along. The situation at the border was perhaps brittle rather than tense. So occupied with their affairs were those gathered there that they did not observe Malian approaching. He heard a hoarse babble of voices from farther away, and saw the huge muzzle of Bumberboom lifted up from behind a rise of ground. The whitewashed stone cairns marking the dominion of the dwarfs stood on each side of the road, and beyond them on each side of the road was another symbol consisting of two long wooden beams painted red. Their ends were planted in the ground, and they inclined towards each other until, for a short space, they criss-crossed. The sight of the two dwarfs brought him to pause a moment and to consider concealment. But they were on foot, and their mounts were tethered off at a distance, and moreover their territory clearly came to an end here, although he was not familiar with what new territory might be symbolized by the red beams. Neither had he before ever seen men like those who stood conversing with the bandies. They wore not the breeches, shirt, and tunic so common elsewhere, but close-fitting upper garments, extending as a sort of hood or cap closely over the scalp, and to which a sort of curious simulated ears were attached, and tights of cloth they wore about their loins. These garments had not the rough look of wool, nor, it suddenly seemed, the dull look of linen, but they had a mightily attractive smoothness and sheen and glow, and they rippled when even a muscle was moved. "Oh, we are so infinitely obliged to the kings of the dwarfs," one was saying, in a tone which seemed to indicate very little sense of true obligation. Rays of sunlight slanted through the bowering branches of the trees and picked out the emblematics embroidered upon the red tunics of the dwarfy men. "We are so obliged to them, through their constables, of course," he bowed and put more expression into the salute than was in his face, "for having sent us this number of greatly desirable guests, and such guests as they are, too." And a second said, with a dull and lowering look, "Our appreciation will be conveyed from our masters to yours very shortly. Have no fears." One of the dwarfs said with a shrug, "They would away, as we have told you, and who can hold what will away? Furthermore, who can argue with Bumberboom?" The other dwarf, hearing, or perhaps subtly feeling, the approach of someone behind, glanced back and saw Mal coming. He took his comrade's arm and turned him around. "Hold, Rafflin, do you remember that report?" Rafflin puckered his caterpillar brows and nodded. "I do, and I do believe, Gorlin, that this is one with whom we would speak. Halt, fellow, in the names of the kings." But Mal, skipping nimbly, said, "It is a false report, to begin with, and a case of erroneous identification, to continue with. Furthermore, the names of your kings are as nothing to me, for I was never their subject. And lastly—" Hold! Lastly, Mal said, lining up beside the stranger men, "I am not, at the present moment, any longer in your section, or your land, at all, and accordingly I defy you, bandy rogues that you are." And he spraddled his legs in contempt at them. The dwarfs grunted their rage, and simultaneously began to reach for their slashes and to move forward upon their crook legs. But the guards from the other side of the border took several paces toward them and regarded them with extreme disfavour. They stopped. "So be it, then," said Rafflin after a moment.
We will not invoke the doctrine of close pursuit, but be assured, stick-pin," he flung the term at unflinching Malian, "and be assured, you other stick-pins, that we will complain upon you for harbouring a malignant, an enemy, a ruffian, fugitive and recusant, a rapiner, and an otherwise offender against our kings, their crowns and staves, and we will demand, and I do not doubt will obtain, his return."
Malian bracked his tongue and again spraddled his legs. Said one of the other guards, "Demand, then. It may be you will secure his return, and with him, too, the return of Bumberboom and all its crew." The dwarfs made no reply to this, but turned and proceeded to their ponies. One of them, however, whirled around and flung out his hand and forefinger at Mal.
"As for you, fellow," he declared roundly, "were you at all instructed in any wise of medicine of history, you would understand, you would know, that the bodily form of the dwarfs is the original bodily form of all mankind. We have only pity for you, who descend out of those misshapen sufferers from the great gene shift."
He swung himself about once more, and neither of them spoke again. The two stout ponies went trot-a-trot down the road, dust motes rising to dance in the sunbeams. Malian turned his head to see the stranger men regarding him without expression. He thrust his hand into his bosom and withdrew the letter of statements in its pouch. He handed it out, to the air, as it were, for none reached to take it. After a moment, and in some perplexity, he asked, "Does none desire to examine the well-phrased let-pass with which my natal territory, or to be more precise, its governance, has supplied me?" With a slight yawn one of them said, and he shook his head, "None of whom I know. Such ceremonies are reserved for those arrived on official purposes, and not for mere proletaries or pro-fugitives." Stung by such belittling indifference, Malian exclaimed to the effect that he was indeed on just such purposes arrived. The strangers smiled at him a trifle scornfully. "These pretensions are at the moment, and under the circumstances, amusing," they said. "But they will not do, Barbado. Oh, no, they will not do at all. Those arrived on official purposes unto this land of Elver State, of which we of the Corps of Guards are both the internal and the external defence, arrive with proper pomp. They, for one thing, are dressed in garments of ceri-cloth, as indeed are we. For another, they ride upon smooth-haired horses, adorned with many trappings of broideries and burnishments, and so do all their party, which by definition is numerous. And for another, and the last, though this by no means the least, they come provided with a multitude of rich donatives, of which distribution is made to the members of the Corps of Guards." Malian cast down his eyes and gnawed upon his lip. "None the less," he declared, "I have been issued with this letter of statements directing all to let me pass, and the fact of your having made no gesture to prevent my passage at all would not altogether seem to justify my failing to present it. And inasmuch as you desire not to trouble to read it, it would be a pretty courtesy on my part to read it to you. I have oftentimes been commended for my reading voice, and I doubt not but that you gallants of the Elver Guards will desire to do the same, and furthermore the problem set down herein, which is the high purpose of my journeyings, may so move you as to search among your minds to see if peradventure you know of a medicine which may shed both light and hope thereon." And he read them the let-pass, or letter of statements, as he had done to the pseudomorphs and to the people of the moon. "Ah, well," said one with a sniffle of his nose, "interesting and absorbing as the beardy one's problem is, and while I doubt not that the medicines of our masters contains an answer to it, it is no more than the speck of a fly compared to the problem lying over the rise there, anent which let us move and consider, for an action of some sort will assuredly be required of our hands." They proceeded upward, and then paused, considering, Mao with them. There had evidently been a house of some sort there below, but it had been unstrategically situated in terms of the attempts of the crew of Bumberboom to pass with their weapon along the road above it. It had gone off the road, and the marks of its going were eaten into the berm, and before it had either been brought to rest or come to rest of its own accord, it had thoroughly crushed the house, the fragments of which were now being unskilfully transformed into cook fires. The harnesses hung empty, the guide ropes lay ignored upon the ground. The crew was both at rest and at meat, and it became at once apparent at other occupations as well. "Scandalous!" exclaimed Mallion. "Shocking!" One of the Elver guards shrugged. "As well be scandalized or shocked at cats and dogs," he said. Mal protested. "But dogs and cats are not human." The upper lip of the Elver guard went up further. "Are those?" he demanded. Not overmuch regarding this remark, Mal allowed his mind to run still more over a notion which, in seedling form, had occurred to him before. Cautiously, tentatively, he began to broach the matter. "I have been in some measure too overwhelmed by your kindliness in offering me refuge," he explained, "from those hangman dwarfs, to express my gratification fully. But—" "No need," the Elver murmured, scratching his armhole. Then, as though only then becoming aware of what he was doing, he stepped back from the berm with a curse and a scowl. "A tetany upon those Whittle swine! They must have fleas as large as mice, if indeed no worse. I am for going away and constructing a steam lodge and boiling self and habit." "Do, Nakanath," murmured another Elver. "And when asked how you proceeded to rid the state of this lumbering menace, be prepared to answer, 'I bathed me.' But for praise or commendation, do not be prepared." The guard Nakanath hesitated, muttered, scratched. Mallion moved his mouth against the sudden fretful silence. "But now that I am able to take 2 consecutive breaths free from fear of bandymen pursuit, and am made aware not only of my safety and refuge, but of the wisdom of those who—" A fight broke out among the crew below, but was soon settled. An Elver said, in a faintly dissatisfied tone, "Ah, he did but club him. I had thought he might well eat him. It would surprise me not a whit." And another said, a peevish note in his voice, bruising a blossom under his nose to counteract the noisome taint now rising from below, "Why need they eat each other when all the world rushes to supply them with far less gamey food? In fact," his face became a sight brighter, "may this not be a possible solution, videlicet, simply to supply them with a steady ration of victual, thus depriving them of incentive to leave their present location? Denizened right here, they remain under supervision and do no further damage and post no further threat." Musing a moment, the others then shook their heads. Another said, "They would breed, Duraneth, at a rate which would soon make their maintenance a cost not to be considered. Further, experience has shown that nomads do not easily take to denization." They sighed and sucked their lips, and their unhappy breaths caused their smooth garments to ripple and shimmer in a marvellous manner, for which Mallion nevertheless had but small eyes. "Whose tolerance has undoubtedly saved my life," he continued resolutely, and a shade more loudly. The Elver guards now turned to consider him and his words. "What is the point of your narration, pro-fugitive?" demanded the one called Duraneth, in his voice a coolness only to be expected in one whose own proposal had just now been considered and dismissed. Barely had he finished asking his question when a head appeared above the berm, its countenance vacant and filthy, and looked at them open-mouthed as they stepped backwards with fastidious precaution. "Captain?" it inquired. "Captain Mogg?" A bellow from below diverted it so that it turned, released its hold, slid down and away, and did not return. The point of my narration, gallant guards Elver, is just this, that I would ask of you a consideration for which I offer to perform a service, thus and thus. Inform me kindly where I may inquire of your masters a medicine to solve the problems of my own land, Canaris, and in return I will rid you and all the land of Elver State forever of Bumberboom and its crew. The green shade flashed blue as a jay noisily chased another through the trees. Narrowly the guards regarded him. Then Naganath said, "Seemingly such an agreement would be of benefit to all and of detriment to none. Still, I am moved to inquire, not from suspicion, fie upon such a thought, but out of mere curiosity and interest, how do you propose to do this?" Mallion's fingers stroked the left and then the right tip of his short beard, through which a slight smile peeped deprecatingly. "To reveal this before an agreement has been reached would perhaps be out of keeping with the traditions of negotiating. I point this out not from suspicion, fie upon the thought, but simply because I have been very traditionally reared, and do not desire to cast reflection upon my upbringing by departing therefrom even in trifles." After another silence, Duranith said, with something like a frown, "Would it be untraditional for you to indicate by which route you intend for yourself and them to depart, and your destination as well?" Mallion said that it would not. Logic, he pointed out, would indicate a departure by the shortest route, other than the one back into the near-lying section of the Dwarf King's dominions, out of the Elver State. And to show his perfect good will and trust in the matter, he would entreat the advice of the company as to a good route to achieve this purpose, accompanied perhaps by a map. And as for his destination, well, I am a hill man by origin, and lonely therefore. Nevertheless, there is naught of the hermit in my background or make-up. I admire also the proximity of fair lowlands and goodly towns to which one may conveniently descend to purchase merchandise with the modest yield of the hills, and therefore—" Duraneth cleared his throat and cast a slant glance at his fellows. "And therefore, inform me if I understand you rightly, Mallion's son Hazel-lip, and therefore you desire information about a place lying outside of Elver State, and situated upon a hill overlooking fair lowlands and goodly towns, or perhaps at least one goodly town. Is it so?" Mal frankly admitted that the conjecture was correct. "At least one goodly town," he murmured, "although 2 or even 3 would be better." The guard lodge had a stark neatness about it which Mallion, familiar with the companionable disorder of Canaris and the opulent show of the dwarfs, found a bit chilling. There were, to be sure, many contrivances visible, which seemed both curious and interesting, as well as an entire shelf bearing naught but books, which much impressed him. "Where are much books is much medicine," he quoted reverently. The Elver guards gave but a nod or two at this, and began to spread a table with maps, and to converse in low tones among themselves, paying to Mal's thoughtfully pointed-out observation that it was now high noon and meal-time, in attention to which the very best of wills could only call coarse. He, therefore, did not feel a compunction at devoting himself forthwith to the smoked pullets and dried fruits, with which his budget had thoughtfully been filled by old Ronan's. And when the guard Nakanath said, over his shoulder, "Attend hither, pro-fugitive," he replied that he in no wise feared that Elver folk would work him a malignancy via use and medicine of his own and proper name, and therefore he would cheerfully respond to it, which was Mallion, son Hazel-lip, high man to the hereditor of land Canaris. "But at the moment I eat," he pointed out. He raised his brows and bit and chewed. The crewmen's supply had all been eaten to a fare-thee-well, and they sat or lay about snoring or scratching, or simply staring about them as Mal approached. He had come quite near before it occurred to them to stare at him. He was already among them before any of them had made up their minds that he perhaps ought not to be. But it was not until he had begun to make a circuit of the ponderous engine that anything like concern began really to make itself evident. The sight of Bumberboom at close up proved interesting enough even to banish the train of thought caused by the sight of the crew close up. The same near-idiot face repeated over and over again in varying stages of grime, the same snaggle and snarl of pale hair and small, vacant, pale blue eyes. What did it mean? It scarcely could mean that the same moron crew, which was now attached to Bumberboom, had created it in the first place. They could never have fashioned those immense and massy wheels of stout wood, reinforced with iron and rimmed with broad iron tires. Never could they have founded that gigantic tube whereon, in the casting, figures of beasts and monsters had been fixed. Never have devised that ornate breech in the shape of a bearded face with lips puckered as though whistling, nor the even more ornate and in fact rather frightening face which terminated the great tube's other end, mouth distended into an enormous shout, mouth silent now, but threatening of anything but silence. Anything but silence now among the crew, whose disturbance bore more resemblance to a poultry-yard than an ant-hill, running and squawking. Thrice in succession people fell full tilt against Malian, but it was certain from their great alarm that it had not been their aim to do so. And as they trotted about, they set up a cry and howl, which presently resolved itself in Malian's ears into the same words, meaningless as yet, which he had heard before from one of them. Now, however, not as a question, but as an appeal for aid. "Captain Mogg! Captain Mogg! Captain Mogg!" And Mal, meanwhile, continued his perambulation and examination. The carriage was fitted with large boxes, but these were locked. He was about to make a closer inspection when someone bellowed close by, and at the same moment something struck him between the shoulder-blades. He took a quick step sideways before spinning around, and the sight of his face acted as instant deterrent to the one who had evidently flung the clod, and was now doing a sort of angry dance with another clod in his hand. His arms were inordinately long and thickly thewed. Chest and trunk were barrel-thick, neck there was none visible, and the broad-nosed face was alive with fury. "Get away!" it shouted, though perhaps with a shade more caution than in its previous bellow. "Get away! Get out! Don't touch her! Get her! Cut your throat!" And the others of the crew, male and female, taking courage from this toothless champion, began to draw in behind him, shaking their fists. "Cut your throat, tell you! Get out! Don't touch her! Bumberboom! Bumberboom!" The rabble, highly approving these sentiments, at once began to shout the word most familiar to them. "Bumberboom! Bumberboom! Bumberboom! Bumberboom!" Malian stood where he was and let them howl, and by they began to tire of it. He had by now become a familiar object to them, and as he neither moved nor spoke, nor did anything of further interest, they grew bored with him. And, one by one, he could see some emotion too faint to be wonder, perplexity of a low order perhaps, begin to overtake them. They did not really know any more why they were there, or why they were so loudly engaged. And so, first one by one, and then, as regarded those who were left, all of a sudden, they ceased their commotion and wandered off. Not so the one who had thrown both turf and threats at Mal. Highly intelligent he was not, but neither was he an utter idiot. He knew that Mal had no business near the great weapon, and he was determined to get him away from it. Regardless of the defection of his crew, he now came a step nearer, hitched up his dissolving breeches, and menaced with his hands. "Go ye! Get out!" he
he bellowed. "Throw you down and kill you don't get out."
Mal asked, "Who are you?" A look of astonishment came upon the man's face. He had evidently never been asked the question before, and it was not any doubt as to his identity, but a shock that his identity was not universally known, which made him go slack. After a moment he said, "Oh, my Captain Mogg is who?" and for emphasis shouted, "Mogg! Captain Mogg! Captain of Bumberboom and all the crew is who?" Malian allowed his own face to register an extreme mixture of enlightenment, astonishment, impressment, and self-deprecation. "Oh, you are Captain Mogg." The captain gave an emphatic nod and grunt, patted his stomach, clearly quite pleased with the effect. "My Captain Mogg," he affirmed, "is who?" "Pardon, senior, pardon, Captain." He bowed and showed his palms. "I didn't know, you see." The man nodded, and came close to smirking, and in fact emitted a pleased sound, which came close enough to being a giggle to be identified as such, grotesque as the sound seemed coming from him. He gazed from side to side, and wiped his loose mouth with the back of his bristly paw. And at that Malian gave a bound and a jump, and sailed forward and upward, and kicked him in the side of the head, and felled him like a tree. Some of the crew observed what happened, and their hoots of astonishment brought others back from casual wandering about the vicinity. They formed a rough circle about the two, though it was without either intention of doing so or awareness of the utility thereof. Several of them growled, and even shouted at Malian, and bared their dirty teeth and spat. One or two even went so far as to look about for a weapon. But what immediately came to view was an overlooked loaf of bread, and in a moment they were too concerned with an idiot quarrel about it to pursue the audacious gesture. Mogg lay a while on his side, his eyes opened. He frowned. He rolled over on his elbows and gazed at Malian and at the crewmen. He smacked his lips tentatively. "Cut your throat," he said, but without real passion. Then he raised his rump, and so in stages got to his feet. "Get out," he repeated. "Kill ya." He looked around for some means of accomplishing this, and saw nothing save his slack-mouthed followers and the great gun. Toward this he flung up his arms. "Bumberboom!" he cried warningly. "Bumberboom! Goddamn son of a bitch and big noise! Drop down dead!" His small pale eyes observed approvingly that Mal, apparently convinced by this fearsome threat, had begun to walk away, and he drew back a trifle to let him pass. Whereat Mal repeated his spring and his sally, and knocked him down again. This time he remained down a much longer time, and when he next arose it was not to address himself to Mal at all. He put his hands at his hips, and threw back his head, and shouted. The words meant nothing of themselves to Mal, but the effect was immediate. The crewmen left their places in the circle, and bent to their positions in the harness and elsewhere. Mogg took a deep breath. He cried, "Forehead hash!" They bent, dug in their feet, groaned. "Bumberboom!" they cried. "Bumberboom!" The limber lifted. "Bumberboom!" The trail lifted. "Bumberboom!" The ponderous equipage trembled, shifted. The great wheels shivered, dropped dirt and turf, turned slowly, but turned. Bumberboom began to move forward. "You may stop her here, Captain Mogg," Mal said presently. The man looked at him. "Stop? Here?" Mogg's face moved uncertainly. Mal gestured, pointed. Then he gave a slight teeter or two, as though readying himself to jump. Mogg crouched, cried out, covered his head with his arms. He shouted, walking backwards, and the cannon's wheels ceased to turn, and the crew promptly slipped its harness and lay down in the road like dogs. Elvegard Nakanath asked, coming forward with his compeers. "You do not propose to leave them there, I trust?" "Not for any longer than is required for us to settle our indentures. You have an information to give me, or rather two, likewise a map." Nakanath's thin lips parted in his thin, smooth-shaven face. He unrolled something in his hands. "Attend, then, Malian, son Hazel-lip, high man to the hereditor of land Canaris. Here is a carto or map which is limned upon strong linen, and we have marked with red a few several places which bear upon this present business. Thus, this border station, this road. Follow my finger now. This road forks here, and here, and here. The right of this last one leads to our capital community, wherein our masters of a surety can medicate your question. But thither you go not now, for instead you are to follow via the left fork of this first furcation, and this leads, as is clearly delineated, to the great rift and all the land Nor. And concerning this same, observe how we have riddled for you a choice of hills, few of which overlook less than a league of fine fat flat land, nor fewer than 2 prosperous trading towns." Malian's pursed lips thrust out in concentration between his beard and his mustachios. He nodded, traced the lines with his brown and furry fingers, so different from the thin, pale digit of his present informer, who, asked what sundry of produce and people land Nor afforded, replied that it was a good yielder of hogs and hides and horses, as well as grain and small timber, but that its people were of a sullen and wilful disposition. "Though I do not doubt," he concluded, "that they will be willing enough to trade with you." "Nor do I," Malian said, well enough pleased. He reached his hand for the map, but it was not forthcoming. Come, Elvis Senior," he said reproachfully. "Surely you do not think that even my own keen mind can have committed the carto to memory? Why, unless you relinquish it, neither I nor my newly gained companions can be sure of finding our way out of Elva State as expeditiously as all of us might wish." Nakanath rolled the map up and thrust it into a tube of worked leather. "You may be well sure of it," he said, "for Guard Duraneth and I will accompany you as far as the rift. We would think it but ill hospitality," he said, "to do other." Malian cleared his throat and avoided eyes. "I am like to be overwhelmed by such high courtesy, but so be it. Captain Mogg, on!" He took his seat with some sullenness upon the cases fixed by the gun-carriage, and, the procession under way, diverted himself by picking the locks. He found in one nothing but some handsful of a mouldy, powdery substance, and in the other nothing but an ill-made book. With a shrug of his shoulders, he began to turn the dusty pages and to read. Presently he cast a glance, swiftly and suspiciously, at the Elva pair, but they, absorbed in moody thought, spared him no look, but rode silently along on their lean horses. He grunted and turned a leaf. The apothecary in the first town wherein they paused threw up his hands as Malian entered. "I have no victualry at all to supply you with," he cried, in a trembling and petulant voice. "By reason of lacking either wife or servant woman, I eat in the cook-shops. Moreover, such treacles and comfits as my shelves afford are of a highly bitter and aperient sort, though a measured quantity may never harm you if you are of a costive disposition. But what can these terms mean to him?" he added in a lower tone, as though to himself. "Is it not known to me, if to none other, that all these cannoneers are as dull of wits as dogs, by virtue of having neither bred nor gendered outside their number for generations? Still, they have the medicine of the deadly noise, and it behoves me to speak dulcetly." He sighed. "What would you, Senior?" 16 1/2 measures of crushed charcoal," said Malian, "to begin with. Large measures, the largest you have." The apothecary's lower lip drooped.
This would suffice to rid of wind the stomachs of a small army, though, to be sure, it is a small army which—" The apple of his throat bobbed in sudden perceptive terror. "Pay no heed to my previous comments, master," he pleaded. "I perceive with utter conviction the falsity of my conjectures. Charcoal, 16½ large measures. Immediately, master, immediately."
He scurried about from keg to ladle to scales, darting looks of bewilderment at Malian. Presently he inquired,
"And what next is your design, lordling? You say 14½ large measures of sulphur? It will be my delight. Nonetheless, may I not point out that sulphur is not in current favour for fumations? Asafoetida is much preferred nowadays as an ingredient to banish the demons and miasmas as well. Observe how I fawn contritely for having made the suggestion. Sulphur it shall be."
The third substance caused him no little concern. He nibbled his mouth and frowned and snuvelled.
"Snowy nitrum, master. Forgive both the poverty of my mind and shop alike, but you hold, I adjure but myself, master lord, is not snowy nitrum another name for what is also termed the saline stone, or saltpetre? In one moment I shall have looked into my lexicon. Thus, and my conjecture was correct. 69 large measures of saltpetre, more correctly denominated snowy nitrum. It may well exhaust my supply, but of that nothing. The dry salters must wait their pickled meats upon a fresh supply, whenever. I know not the use nor preparation of this triune of charcoal, sulphur, and saltpetre. Shall I triturate it for you with a mortar and pestle?"
"By no means," Malian said hastily. "That is, reflection seems demanded here." He pulled a bit on his beard and peeped from under his lashes at the apothecary, a small and bony-browed man of no particular age. There were things which this one was accustomed to doing which Malian had never done himself. Furthermore, he had said a thing which Malian wished to hear be said again, and at more length. The more he considered, the more he favoured the notion. At last cleared his throat and spoke. "Senior apothecary, is yours a trade which might be swiftly sold with a profit?" The drugsman looked out the open door in a quick and fearful look. He put his dry lips up to Malian's sun-browned ear.
"There is no business to be sold for a profit in Elver State," he hissed. "The taxers lurk like beasts of prey. Why do you ask? There is no business even to be held for a profit. Why, lordling mine, do you ask? What is stational commerce to you? You pass through, master, with your giant's thundermaker, and you are supplied, and you pass on, and you pass on. Neither profits, nor taxes, nor stocks, nor sales are matters you need review. Why do you ask?"
Indeed, the shop did have a decidedly well-taxed look to it, and its meagre shelves. Mal was fortunate in having obtained the things he wanted. "The Free Company of Cannoneers," he caught the open-mouth, blank look. "Bumberboom, that is."
"Oh, aye, master, Bumberboom."
"The Free Company of Cannoneers is in need of the services of a responsible and learned man, versed in such medicines as history and, for another example, apothecation, and it thus befalls me to wonder—" The apothecary genuflected and kissed Malian's hands and knees. He locked his shop and deposited the keys with a local chirurgeon. And that night, whilst the crew lay deep in snoring and the Elver guards camped disdainfully apart with heads upon saddles, he and the apothecary spoke long and low together beside a guttering fire, and the coldly indifferent stars pulsed overhead.
"No,"
said the chemist, whose name was Zembak Bix.
"No, master lord, I have made no especial study of the matter. All of my life, Bumberboom, or as some call it, Juggernaut, has been a byword. Bad mothers frighten bad children with it. One comes across references to it in chronicles. Whence it first came, neither do I nor anyone else know, nor who first devised it. I was a younger man when first I saw it. Most fled in terror, or hasted to bring out food, but I tarried as near as I dared. So it was, or so it seemed, that none but I noticed that these fearsome fellows were little better, if better at all, than idiots. This one Mogg was not then their captain. I know not what he was named. 'Twas long ago, and my mind has been crammed over full ever since of drug receipts and tax demands. Well, but he was not quite an idiot. Indeed, I think he was a whit wittier than this one. Let us say a moron, then. And off they trundled, I wondering as they went. Twice more before to-day have I seen them, and heard of them more than twice. It has been counted a cause for thanks that, unlike other wandering almsmen, they never ravished nor rapted away any women. They took no recruits either. The reason for this gensual clannishness I cannot say, but its results are plain. No fresh genes have come their way since, who knows when. And whatsoever flaws they had amongst them to start with, such have been multiplied and squared and cubed, to use the tongue of the medicine called mathematic. And thus only idiot habit keeps them going and coming and passing to and fro, and only equally idiot habit keeps the rest of the world a-fearing them and yielding to them. I cannot say how old this olden book you found may be, a century at least, I venture. It is not by the gun alone, then, nor by medicine alone, then, that the great noise and destruction comes. No, but by these three substances, mixed and moisted and dried and cracked and sieved. By my cod and cullions, this is no small thing you have discovered.
Malian spat into the fire. Then he reached out in the dimness and gently took Zembak Pix the apothecary by the throat. "You must remember that pronoun," he said softly. He felt the apple of the throat bob up and down. "I, not you, I, not we, I." Fortunately, Malian's son Hazellip is of a trusting nature. He released his grasp.
"Fortunately," said Pix in a tremulous whisper.
"I have great plans, great needs. I can offer great rewards. You, potion man, may become the counsellor of the counsellors of kings. Therefore be exceedingly virtuous and exceedingly cautious." He gazed into the other's eyes, glinted by a single dull red spot of fire-glow in each, and watched them move as the other nodded. They stood upon the lip of the cliff. There, down beyond, lay the rift, wide and uneven and hummocked here and there, and beyond, on the other side, the ruins huddled haggardly. Malian spat stoutly. "It will be no easy crossing," he observed. "Still, I perceive there is a road of sorts, and cross we must. Nevertheless—" He paused so long that Duraneth and Nakanath stirred somewhat restlessly, and the unease communicated itself to the other elders, who had ridden out from their near-adjacent city to witness both arrival and departure.
"What mean you by nevertheless?"
Nakanath asked. Perhaps still recollecting his flea-bite, he reined his horse up a way apart from Bumberboom and its crew. The way hither had followed no rigid schedule. The crew, waked to the day when it felt the day full upon it, was by no means immediately prepared for toil, and made up for its swiftness at eating by its almost pythonic requirements for post-digestive rests. Nakanath had urgently hinted for more speed. Mal had, rather less urgently, passed it on to Captain Mogg, and Captain Mogg had cursed and kicked and cudgelled, and gotten a short burst of increased pace, for a moment or so, at intervals. "By nevertheless," Malian said, rather slowly, "I mean that there is something which we must do before we begin to cross. He issued a loud order to Mogg, who issued a louder one. Mogg knew nothing of Mallion's quest, nothing of the problem behind Mallion's question. All he knew to the point was that if Mal asked him to do something and he did not do it, he would be kicked in the head. He had tried a number of ways to avoid this, but the only one which ever worked was to obey orders quickly. Slowly, therefore, erratically, Bumberboom began to move around, until its great muzzle was pointing toward the rift. Another order, and the massive gun was unlimbered. Its trail now rested on the ground. Nackernath cleared his throat, looked at Duraneth. Duraneth returned the look. "What?" And I point out the extreme civility with which the question is asked. "What is it your intention to have done now, son Hazel-lip?" Mal stroked the points of his beard. "It is my intention to fire the gun," he said. The horsemen backed up a pace or two or three, as though they had practised the movement. "Fire? Fire, Bumberboom?" "So some call it. Others, I understand, prefer the name of Juggernaut." One of the elders said, "I have not heard that this has been done at all of late." He cleared his throat twice. "So much the better for doing it now. The crew wants practice, and no one can object to whatever damage may be done the rift." Nackernath said rather sharply, "The rift? It is not the rift which concerns us. We are still on Elver soil, and I consider the possible great damage which may be done there too, including, and this is no small consideration, to us. It would be much better for you to wait until you are already in the rift." "No, it would not. I desire to calculate a matter called range, a matter of arcane medicine, which it will henceforth be important for me to know, and in particular the trajectory, as calculated from an eminence of land, as it might be a cliff or hill." The Elvers consulted hurriedly together, and then requested that Mallion might delay his calculations until they were able to get well away from the sight. He frowned, gave a short and slightly impatient nod, and they were off even faster than the two dwarfy men had gone the time Mallion had hidden in the ditch. "They fear the fatal noise," he said to Zembak Pix with a twisted grin. "It is as well. The less they see, the better so. Well, down goes the large-grained powder, as the book directs. Hold firm the ladle, Zembak Pix. So, smoothly, so." Mallion took the ram and tried to follow the directions so that the powder was securely back where it should be, but not so firmly packed that it would not properly ignite. Then, satisfied, he ordered the shot brought forward. Mogg and his mates came up with the great round stone, hoisted it, dropped it. The man responsible howled for his toes, and then howled for his ribs as Mogg beat upon them. But it was done at last. Next, the fine powder was laid in a train along the groove to the touch-hole. "What next?" asked Mallion. Pix looked into the book. "Next is fire," he said. "Captain Mogg, a brand of fire." The crewmen seemed unsure of how they should seem. What memories they might hold of actual gunfire must be at many removes and quite dim, muted not by time alone, but by the thick membranes of their sluggish minds. They had been bred to the gun, lived by and for the gun, had naught but the great gun at all. Yet they had never fired it, had forgotten how to make its fuel, forgotten perhaps all save some dim glints of recollections of old mumblings and mutterings which served them for history. They were excited, they were uneasy. Something new had come into their brute lives. One of them, who had watched the loading, perhaps spoke for all. "Bumberboom, Bumberboom, eat," he said. Zembak Pix received the burning stick and said, before handing it to Mal, "Stand carefully as the handbook directs, lest the cannon crush you by its—" But Mallion, impatient, seized the fire and thrust it at the train of powder. It hissed, vanished. Then, with a roar like thunder waging war on thunder, the hideous muzzle-mouth spewed flame and smoke. The gun leaped as though wounded, fell back, subsided. Darkness, thick darkness, evil stench surrounded them. Gradually it cleared away. They looked at each other. "Recoil," Zemback Pix finished his sentence. The crew rose slowly from the ground, idiot faces round with awe and terror and joy. The occasion required words. They found them, or at least it. "Bumberboom! Bumberboom! Bumberboom!" They leaped and lurched and shouted and roared. "Bumberboom! Bumberboom! Bumberboom!" Zemback Pix pointed far out into the rift.
"The shot seems to have scored a trench along that hillock. Ha!
So I see, yes. Suppose that were a row of houses. Ha! 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 Elver houses, bandy houses. Ha! Ha! Something caught their eye. Something gleamed there in the trench now as clouds drifted away and the sun came through, a something which seemed to have slightly deflected the path of the stone shot. They discussed what it might be, agreed that whatever it might be could well go on waiting. "Captain Mogg, on! Forehead! Hush!" It was a while later that they saw the Elvers descending by another road, which allowed them to steer far clear of the great gun and its crew, a line of Elver horsemen, and behind each guard and riding on the crupper a man with a spade. "Curious," said Mal.
"Very curious, Master Lord,"
agreed Zemback Pix. But by the time they themselves had gotten close enough to leave the toiling, chanting crew and go and see, the sight was more than merely curious.
"Observe, Malian son Hazellip,"
said Nacanath, in an odd tone and a gesture.
"See what sight the monstrous voice of Bumberboom has uncovered."
It was a sight indeed. The hillock had been shovelled and the ground excavated a good way beneath the surface of the general ground level. There lay revealed the immense figure of an image with upraised arm and with a crown or coronet upon its head, from which radiated a series of great spikes, at least twice the length of a man. As far as they could see, it was clad in a flowing garment of some strange sort. It was an unfamiliar shade of blue-green, which was almost black. "What is it?" asked Malian, voice low with awe. The Elvers shrugged. "Who can say? It seems to be hollow." Thus Nacanath. Duraneth had something else to say. "Do you recall, Prince of Canaris?" he began. Malian noted his own promotion in rank, but showed nothing on his face. "Do you recall what said the dwarfy constable, as say they all, of course, that before the great gene shift all men were of their dwarfish size?" Malian said, "I do recall. What of it?" Slowly Duraneth said, "This great image is hollow. There are passages within, but the spaces seem exceedingly small. Do I suppose that this evidences a possible truth to the absurd bandy boast? Never. As well declare that the gigantic statue demonstrates that the original form of mankind was that of a race of the gigants." Duraneth nodded slowly. Then his eyes moved from gigantic statue to gigantic gun, and back once more. "I wish," he began, "I wish I knew what it had held in its hand," he said. "Oh, I do not know, of course, that it had held anything in its hand. It has an arm. It must have had a hand. No consequence. It was a mere sudden fancy, of no rational importance." But Malian had now a question of his own. He pointed down into the pit, past a fallen tree, to where 4 Elvers stood regarding the newly found wonder, and a 5th stood upon its face. On the brim stood a box of strange sort, from which wires led down to the body of the statue. "What's that?" he asked. Duraneth shrugged.
An engine, a toy, really. It simulates a magnetical current. Really, it tells us nothing, save only that the entire figure seems to be made of metal, all of it. Incredible. No, I suppose you are correct. About the original stature of man, the matter, I must suppose, remains as before.
For yet another moment he stood there, musing. Then he said,
When you are ready, Prince, to pose your question, we will be ready to serve you in seeking its answer. Do not tarry too long among the morose and barbarous folk of Nor. Fare you well, fare you well.
The morose and barbarous folk of Nor had, for the most part, forewarned by the echoing roar of Bumberboom's soul shot, and further by the sight of it being toiled across the Trans-Rift road, fled into the raddled ruins, where it was hardly practicable to follow them. They had taken much of their substance with them, but the crew were experienced foragers. Noses keen as dogs, they soon sniffed out food, and even sooner devoured it. Malyon had no desire to go groping about in the ruins after anyone. He consulted the map. Nakanath still held the leathern tube, but Mal held the map, whether Nakanath knew it or not, and consulted Zembak Pix as well.
I would that I had reflected to demand, to request horses of the Elvers. Doubtless they could be trained to pull the gun.
The apothecary's eyes narrowed beneath their bony brows, and he smiled a knowing smile.
Horses will come later, he said. Horses and many other things.
Getting Bumberboom up a hill had to come first. After that would come supplies, not hastily proffered or hastily seized to be hastily gobbled, but efficiently levied to be efficiently distributed, and efficiently consumed. Not all of them. The key word was surplus. Surplus of commodity meant trade, which meant wealth and power. One area of farms and towns to start with. Power firmly established there meant a fulcrum firmly established there, and with a fulcrum once established, what might not leverage do? But haste was not to be indulged in. Leaving Zembak Pix in charge of gun and crew, Mal set off to scout out the land, with a particular emphasis on hills. The first one he came to overlooked, to be sure, fine fat fields and no less than 4 towns, all of them prosperous. But the roads leading up the hill were too narrow by far to admit of Bumberboom's huge carriage being taken up. Widening would be a matter of months, not to be thought of. The second hill was easy of access, but looked down on one small town only, and that none too favoursome in its appearance. He sighed, pressed on. A third hill was well located, but culminated in a peak of rocky scarps, such as could afford a biding place only to birds. A fourth, a fifth. Perhaps it was the 7th hill which seemed so ideal in every way but one. There was a slope of mountable angle. The top was both flat and wide, with enough trees to provide shade when desired, and yet without interfering with the manoeuvrability of the great gun. From the summit Mal could see widespread and fruitful fields, and the rooftops of several towns. He had passed by 2 of them, and observed with approbation the signs of good care and productivity, and a third appeared to be large enough to justify an assumption of the same. It was as tempting, as inviting from above, as it had seemed from below. Therefore he had surmounted it, despite a difficulty exemplified in the mud, even now drying on his feet and shanks. There was definitely a current. One could not exactly say that a swamp lay at the foot of the hill, athwart the only possible approach, but there was no gravel-bottomed shallow ford, though carefully he looked for one. Mud. Sticky, catchy mud, and Bumberboom, mired securely, was as good as no Bumberboom at all. Malyon sighed and retraced his steps. There was a man in the water when he came through it again, breeches slung around his shoulder, and shirt tucked up shamelessly around his ribs, and he was spearing small fish with a trident. "Fortune favour you," said Mal. The man said, "Fortune favour you," repeated Mal, a trifle louder, a trifle annoyed.
"We don't say fortune favour you in these parts."
"Oh, what do you say, then?"
"We say,
"Oh, well then,
Hmm.
And the man speared another small fish, and another, gutted them and strung them. He had set up a small makeshift smokehouse ashore, and now proceeded to deposit his catch therein, before returning to securing more. "You prefer smoked fish to fresh fish?"
"No, I don't," the man said decidedly. "But they keep, and fresh ones don't. Be you purblind? Look, see that dried mud yonder side, and nigh side? I catch fish while there be water. Soon there'll be none till the rains."
Mallion wondered that he had not observed this before. "Senior, I thank you," he said sincerely. "Now indulgently inform me what you say in these parts for farewell." The man peered into the water.
"We say,
he answered. Mal sighed.
Said the fisherman.
He scratched his navel and speared another fish. "What governance have you in these parts?" he inquired of a man leading a pack-horse as he passed through the next town.
"None," said the man, "and wants none. The land nor is non-governanced by definition."
"I see. I thank you." said Mal.
Said the packman.
He accompanied the great gun all the way, but sent Zemback Pix ahead and aside to spread the word that other lands and their rulers, as it might be the kings of the dwarfs or the masters of Elver State, envying the ungovernance condition of Land Nor, had determined to send armies, troops, spies, and other means of assault thereto, with the intention of establishing a governance over it and over its people. But that the Free Company of Cannoneers, hearing of the demoniacal plan, had come unsolicited to the defence of Land Nor with a weapon more utile than 1,000 swords, videlicet the great cannon Bumberboom. Zemback Pix went forth and fro, and by caught up with Mal and Mog and crew, where they were encamped on a threshing-floor. "Spread you the word?"
"Most diligently, Master Lord."
"And with what countenance and comments did they receive it?" The apothecary seemed to hesitate.
"For the most part," he said, "without change of countenance, and with no other comment than the labial consonant
Mal pondered. Then he raised his eyes. "You say, for the most part?"
"A true relation of my statement, Master Lord. There was an exception, a tiresome and philosophizing man who keeps an hostelry for the distribution of liquor of malt."
Here Zemback Pix wet his lips very slightly and made a small smile.
"And his comment was to the effect that Land Nor is non-governanced by definition, and it thus follows that Land Nor cannot be governanced inasmuch as, according to the laws of logic, a thing is not what it is not, but is what it is, and to speak of the governancing of Land Nor is to speak of the moving of the immovable, which is to speak nonsense." And much other words he spoke, but only to recapitulate what he had already spoken.
Mal said nothing, but after a moment he shook his head. Then he rose from the threshing-floor.
"Captain Mogg, on!"
Captain Mogg rose from the threshing-floor.
"Forehead, hush!"
The crew rose from the threshing-floor, and fell to in its sundry posts and places.
"Bumberboom! Bumberboom! Bumberboom! Bumberboom!"
The great wheels trembled.
"Bumberboom!"
The great wheels moved.
"Bumberboom!"
The great wheels turned. Along the dusty roads it trundled and rumbled. Not in one day did it reach the base of the hill, nor in 2, nor 3. but by the time it reached it, most of the marshy stream had vanished away, leaving a foundation of good, hard, sun-baked mud. Fallen trees were selected and trimmed to act as brakes and props, and when the now dwindled stream had dwindled to a mere trickle, they began the ascent. They shouted, they chanted, they grunted rhythmically, they howled, they pushed, they pulled, they levered. Now and then they turned a rope around a stout tree. Now and then they rested the gun upon the logs and panted and drew breath, then fell to once again. Bumberboom! 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 And at last they dragged it up upon the very crown and summit of the hill, wheeled it into the best place of vantage, and unlimbered it. "Now," said Mal, "to compose and distribute a proclamation." Zemback Pix assisted him in the wording of it, which was to the effect that the Free Company of Cannoneers had now commenced the arduous duty of defending land Nor against alien and hostile forces intent upon establishing a governance over the land aforesaid, and that in order to compensate the previously denominated Free Company, and in order to sustain it subsequently, and to guarantee its defensive postures, voluntary contributions according to the schedule subappended would be received. Each town was held responsible for collecting the donatives of its citizens, and should any town fail to collect and transport the voluntaries assessed it, this would reveal that it was secretly supporting the tyrannical alien pro-governance plan, whereat it would be necessary for the Free Company to bombard the town aforesaid, and herein fail not. "How shall we sign it?" asked Mal, mightily pleased by the several crisp turns of phrase.
"Might I suggest, Master Lord, a succinct Malian general commandanting?"
Very good, but do you not recollect how the Elver Guard referred to me as Prince? I do not wish to appear high-flown or much given to elaborate titles. What think you, then, of a simple Malian prince? What?"
Zemback Pix nibbled the end of his quill.
"Beautifully suggested, lordling. Subsequently, when they are ready, one must not seem over-humble to commence with."
A breeze wafted up from the terrain below, and it conveyed in it a hint of hogs, hides, horses, and others of the rich usufructs of the land. A faint smile played upon Malian's features.
"I allow myself to be persuaded," he said. "So be it. Go now, have copies made, post them in the public places, and proclaim it at the crossroads. You may accompany the first train of tribute, of donative, if you wish."
Zemback Pix declared it would be his pleasure. He descended. He ascended. Time had elapsed.
"Canting and poxy-pothecary!" Mal cried, raging. "Where have you been, and why so long? Where are the voluntaries of food and drink and staples, of steeds and of trade goods and manufactured artillery? From what knacker's yard did you steal that wretched beast which mocks the name of horse? Answer, reply, and give good account, else I will spread you to the off-wheel of Juggernaut and flog you with the traces."
Zemback Pix descended delicately from the scrap of rug bound with a rope cinch which served him for saddle, and was momentarily seized with a spasmodic contraction of the glottis, which impeded his speech, and may possibly have been responsible as well for the slight instability of his gait. And in his arms he tenderly cuddled a firkin containing some sort of liqueous matter.
"Master Lord," he began, "with the utmost diligence have I carried out every word of your instructions, whether plainly expressed or merely implied. I purchased writing materials, I made clear copies in the most exquisite calligraphy, and I long retained in my possession a specimen, the mere sight of which would instantly persuade you. Alas, that on returning hither I was with infinite reluctance constrained to employ it for a usage too gross to be named between us, though even kings must live by nature. Furthermore, I posted them in the public places, and I proclaimed their message at the crossroads. Moreover, I entered into all places of resort and refreshment in order the more thoroughly to disseminate the matter. Conceive, then, with what incredulous and tearful regret I must report that, far from hastening to contribute to the meritorious support of the Free Company, they merely hastened to confect pellets of wool and wax to stuff into their ears to save them, as they said, from the horrid noise and torturesome sound of Bumberboom. The steed and this firkin of liquor of malt do not represent, lordling, even one single poor contributor, but only my success in a game of skill at which I was constrained to participate, they threatening me with many mischiefs and malignancies should I refuse.
There was a long silence. Then Zemback Pix, sighing deeply, drew from the firkin of liquor a quantity in a leather cup, and offered it to Malian. And in truth it did not smell ill. The breeze played upon the hill. The crewmen dozed or picked for lice. The sun was warm. "To think of such ingratitude," Mal said after a while. Zemback Pix wept afresh to think of it. They were mildly surprised to find themselves holding to the wheels of the cannon and gazing down upon the reprobate lands below. "I owe it to my father not to disgrace his name and station by a breach of my word. Would you not agree?"
"Utterly, Master Lord."
"I said that contumacy would merit bombardment."
He belched slightly upon the vowels of the last word.
"And so it must be."
In this they were in perfect accord, but a slight difference of opinion now arose as to whether the town nearest below lay at a distance of 200 lengths, or at one nearer to 300 lengths, and also whether the demonstrated distance of Bumberboom's range was as much as 300 lengths, or as little as 200 lengths. They concluded that it was better to use more force than necessary rather than less than necessary, and they accordingly loaded a charge a third heavier than that used before. Furthermore, on the same principle, they rammed a double shot down the barrel.
"And now for to prime her,"
said Zemback Pix, giggling slightly.
"Hold,"
said Mal.
"Last time we were too close to witness the moment of ejection. I would witness this act, and not have my vision clouded with smoke."
The apothecary nodded and chuckled.
"Perfectly do I understand and take your meaning. I shall lay a long powdered trail. Let me use this length of wood as a gently inclined plane. Excellent, excellent. The powder stays in place and does not slide off. And thus, and thus, and thus. I seem to have used up the last of the powder."
His face was so woebegone that Malian was constrained to laugh.
No matter, no matter. We will make more. Is not the recipe contained in the formulary book? Where is the fire stick? Oh, here. Ha! Hear it sizzle. So, morose and barbarous you have been termed, folk of Nor, and now here is your requision for...
All the thunders of the sky and the lightnings thereof burst upon them in rolling flashes of fire and smoke. The earth shook like a dying man, and they were instantly thrown upon the quaking ground. Things flew screaming over their heads. They lay deafened and stunned for long moments. Malian, presently seeing Zemback Pix's mouth moving, said with a groan,
"I cannot hear. I cannot hear."
"I had not spoken. Woe, mercy, malignant fates, where is Bumberboom?"
And the crew, now picking themselves up from the dirt, with shrieks and wails, began the same question. Bumberboom! 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 But a few fragments of twisted metal and a shattered wheel were all that remained of that great cannon and weapon more utile than 1,000 swords. Malian felt a sob shake his throat. All his plans, all his efforts, wasted and shattered in a single moment. He fought for and found control. "Age and disuse," he said, "must have corroded the barrel. Never mind, we will somehow contrive to cast another." Zemback-Pix agreed, and said through his tears, "And to prepare more powder, 4 1/2 measures of sulphur to 31 1/3 of you err. It was of a certainty 25 1/5 of sulphur to 6 1/8 of snowy. Was it 11 1/10 of? We must consult the formulary." But of that sole book wherein alone the arcane and secret art of gunnery was delineated, only one scorched bit of page remained, and on it was inscribed the single word, "Overload." There was another silence, the longest yet, disturbed only by the idiotic and inconsolable ululations of the crew. In a different voice, Malian said, "It's just as well. Clearly the engine represented a mere theorizing, and, as we have plainly seen, it is of no practical value whatsoever. What is perhaps more to the point, I observe that the horse is uninjured, and I propose we mount him immediately, and proceed by way of the woods to the northern and nearest border of this land of morose and barbarous folk, for I trust not their humours at all." "Oh, agreed, Master Lord," declared Zemback-Pix, scrambling up behind him. "Only one question more. What of the erstwhile crew? Should we try to persuade them to follow?" Mal wheeled the horse around. "I think not," he said. "Soon enough their bellies will bring them down to where the pantries and the bake-ovens of the Norfolk are. But we will not tarry to witness this droll confrontation. We will, however, think about it. I am of the firm opinion that they deserve one another." He kicked his heels into the horse's sides, and Zemback-Pix smote it on the rump. They rode down the hill.
So what'd you think?
I love it as a story. It's a nice bridge, I think, between the early Avram stuff, which I suspect particularly not so much the ones which are quintessentially Avram, like All the Seas with Oysters or House the Blakeney's built, or Sources of the Nile, but the other stuff that he was churning out, I suspect partially to keep a roof over his head at the time.
Yep.
And the later, even more complex stuff, which comes, I think, from Phoenix and Vera onwards. But it's more of it reminds me more, if you're going to look at the novels, of the Peregrine set, because it's a bit more accessible. There's obviously lots going on there, but it's not, you don't have to take notes as much as you do with the Virgil books,
Right.
particularly the later ones, where you can. It's quite easy to get lost in them, not because everything's not there, but because it places lots of information in various places that then becomes important later on. So it is something which bears rereading. And I think, as I said, it's nicely in between those two periods. So it's probably a good starting point of Avram's style, but also one where it's not too easy to get lost.
Yeah. If you had to summarize it a little bit, what would you give as the summary for this story if you just had to summarize it kind of quickly?
I think it's on the main character. I'll not call him a hero necessarily.
Right.
Is has had problems as an aristocrat of his own country, which has obviously suffered a decline from the great gene shift, which
Yep.
I'll say more about a bit later, and is therefore looking for what he calls medicine, which is either science or magic, because it seems to apply to both of those, which is going to restore the fortunes of his homeland. And he's therefore traveling through various through the sort of balkanized United States with all sorts of different people who have mutated and changed after this gene shift
Yep.
outside their own countries, and then comes across the title piece, the Bumberboom, which is a giant cannon, and that's obvious to us, but isn't necessarily obvious to anybody else, including the people who are dragging it across the US, um, who've inbred and degenerated to a point where they have no idea why they're doing it, what they're doing, what this thing is. And then when he starts to have a look at this thing, he realizes what it is from some instruction manuals that are in there, and sees it as an opportunity to be able to get something. And it's interesting, the shift, because at first, I thought he was a bit of a rogue,
Yep.
but you then start to see this is not so much about doing something for his own country, but doing something for himself.
Hmm.
So his character, I think, undergoes a shift at that point.
Yeah. And then what did you think of? I felt like, and maybe I'm mistaken, that I don't know why, it just sort of struck me that it was poking a little bit at dwarves and elvers, and almost felt tokenish, poking fun at. I don't know if that was purposeful or if I just read into that.
I'm not so sure about. I mean, certainly using the creatures out of folklore
Yep.
to, which is the source that Tolkien obviously used as well, to populate this future for the world. And I think, he was certainly having fun with the idea of using stock folklore characters, but putting them in this future world, which I said clearly is the US, because you've got the Planet of the Apes moment
Right,
partway
right.
through,
Yep.
where he manages to fire the Bumberboom, and it uncovers the Statue of Liberty, which they have no idea what it is, and wonder whether it were either giants or tiny, because they
Right.
were able to go through. This was some sort of dwelling that they'd built themselves.
And do you think, I was trying to decide, are these, actual dwarves and elves, or are they part of the gene shift?
I'm sure they're part of the gene shift.
Okay.
Uh, I mean, because he makes so much play of the great gene shift all the way through. Um, that sounds to me as if that's exactly what's happened. There are people who have mutated and resemble those, and therefore people have used adopted those terms because they're folklore terms.
Got it. And then what else in the story? Anything else of note that jumped out at you in the story?
I think, as I said, it's very much a sort of comedy of manners, in
Yeah.
that he's navigating this world and having to work out what the customs and what um, the different mores of the people who he's coming across are, in order to get to where he thinks he needs to go. as part of that. And it does, I said, it does remind you a bit of Jack Vance
Mhm.
and those the planetary romances that he would do, where people would be moving across um, different planets and encountering different little groups of humans or aliens, and having to work out um, how they were different from them.
And I think going back just one more, you talked about Malian a little bit. Any more thoughts in particular about Malian as a character?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I really liked him at the beginning. It did seem to be that sort of picaresque rogue, like Kugler Clever in Jack Vance.
Yep.
The bit that changed it for me was when he suddenly attacked the pharmacist,
Mm-hmm.
show that, he was in charge of this. He was
Yep.
effectively a servant and somebody he could drag along to it. And after that, I felt it moved into somebody who was less pleasant and was more out for themselves rather than what they'd said their quest was all about.
Yeah.
And that
So
that comes through even more in the sequel.
yeah, yeah, definitely, which we'll have to do. Well, in every episode, I always like to talk a little about how we would adapt one of Avram's stories to film or television. I think this would be, I mean, absolutely hilarious as either dark and hilarious as either a movie or a series. How would you adapt it if you were adapting it?
I think it's a 2 hour film. I
Hmm.
think it's. I mean, you'd certainly want. I suspect you want to do it on one of the more sympathetic streaming services who
Yeah,
actually do stuff without changing everything and throwing in characters because they've got an actor they want to cast in there, so they want to
yeah.
give them a part. I mean, one of the best adaptations I've seen recently is Neil Gaiman's work on Good Omens,
Hmm.
which was totally faithful to the original. And again, if I was going to cast Malian, I think I would go for David Tennant.
Oh wow. Oh my gosh. I
Yes. I think because it all set, even though it's set in America, and even though you do get some Americanisms in there, it's a bit high culture in the conversation. So
100%.
somebody like Tennant who would be able to do that and is also really good at doing villains as well, or questionable characters, as well as the straight sort of the Doctor Who heroics. And and you would obviously get it. It will need some CGI, but actually not as much as lots of other things do. It
Yeah.
is far more about the character interaction than enormous special effects, apart from Bumberboom itself, which you could easily model.
Yeah. I completely agree, and I think that's a great person to play the role. Uh, I'm curious how who would play the folks carrying around Bumberboom, and I thought in particular Captain Mogg would be an interesting person to cast.
Yeah, Andy Serkis, I would cast, um, because I mean his work on Gollum
Mm.
was amazing, and his ability again to do that very good physical acting and character acting, and
Yeah.
not wanting to play the hero all of the time, just wanting to portray the inner essence of somebody who's not obviously normal.
Wow, that would be incredible. Okay, one more, or another question that just sort of struck me. Your Avram Davidson so well. If you were in charge of all of the intellectual property. What story would you want to see most adapted, either as a film or a series? What story would make you the most excited to see? I'm just curious.
I think I would like to see an Esterhazy series because again, there's so much richness in there which you could use,
Yep.
so much in which you could set the scene in terms of the location, which there are lots of places in Europe where you fairly easily find somewhere that would adapt itself, not least in the Balkans still, because
Yeah.
quite a lot of that has not been changed that much. And it's that whole Sherlock Holmes vibe, I think, is one that could be done really well, but also because there's the intrigues are so interesting in there, and the comedy would come out in
Yeah.
those stories as well.
Oh, that would be fascinating. And would you see it as a series, do you think, or more?
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think a scene of of standalone episodes on each of the stories,
that'd be
so that you
amazing.
didn't, because I hate long adaptations. I've never watched any of Game of Thrones,
Mm.
because I just don't want to commit myself to that amount of work. And
Cool.
George Martin is somebody who I like some of his work,
Mhm.
but I'm particularly I loved one of his least popular books, which was the one about rock music, whose name will come to me in a minute. The Armageddon Rock, I think it was.
Okay.
Um, but I'm not into big books and big, enormous series because it's just too much investment at my time of
Yeah.
life.
Well, this has been so much fun. Well, I definitely have to do it again. If you'd like to, I'd certainly love to do another one.
Absolutely.
Before we go, is there anything else that you'd want to add or discuss before we sign out?
No, I think I would just love to say to anybody who's watching, go out and read Avram, because if you haven't done that, you're in for a treat. And if you have done it, and particularly if you haven't read mature Avram, then go out and do that because it's such a treasure trove of knowledge and wit and story.
This has been amazing. I can't thank you enough.
My very great pleasure.
Conductor David Zinman, who now leads the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra in Bumberboom by Sidney Hodkinson. Sidney Hodkinson, Bumberboom, a Scherzo Diablique for symphony orchestra from 1982, performed by the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra, conducted by David Zinman. Bumberboom was based on the science fiction short story by American writer Avram Davidson.
Oh, I suppose God only knows. It sounds like a story to me, some crazy fable that you would not believe.